Chapter 5. The Ransom of Rome. The nature of the vine. Long before it became a ubiquitous, overlooked shaker on every diner table in the modern world, the dried, wrinkled drupe of the Piper nigrum vine was the absolute measure of global wealth. It was a tropical anomaly born in the humid, dense jungles of the Malabar coast of the Indian subcontinent. It was a product of fierce monsoon winds, brutal oceanic trade routes, and the insatiable culinary demands of the Mediterranean elite. By the late 4th century, it was the undeniable, universally recognized king of spices. Yet, the true power of black pepper was never merely culinary. It was profoundly political, representing a concentration of capital that could alter the fate of nations. To understand how a simple, flowering vine reshaped the global map, one must examine the darkest hours of the early 5th century. One must look to the autumn of 408 AD. Rome was no longer the administrative capital of the Western Roman Empire. The Emperor Honorius, terrified of the shifting tides of war and the encroaching barbarian federations, had cowardly relocated his court to the swamp-protected fortress city of Ravenna in 402 AD. Nevertheless, Rome remained the spiritual, cultural, and economic epicenter of the Mediterranean world. It was a bloated, magnificent metropolis of nearly 1 million mouths, protected by the sprawling 19-kilometer circumference of the Aurelian walls. It was a city that produced almost nothing of agricultural value, but consumed everything the known world had to offer. Rome survived solely on the massive tribute of its subjugated provinces, demanding endless fleets of Egyptian and North African grain, alongside caravans of Arabian incense and Indian spices. It was a fragile ecosystem of extreme luxury, highly vulnerable to disruption. The patrician class of Rome existed in a state of perpetual indulgence, wholly detached from the violent realities of their collapsing borders. They seasoned their roasted hares and mulled wines with copious amounts of imported spices, completely oblivious to the geopolitical storms gathering in the north. In September of 408 AD, that violent disruption finally arrived at their gates. Alaric, the brilliant, battle-hardened king of the Visigoths, marched a massive army across the Julian Alps and descended into the Italian peninsula. He did not come as a mindless, unwashed savage, as later Roman propaganda would desperately claim. He was an Arian Christian, a seasoned tactician, and a former high-ranking commander in the Roman military machine. Alaric had bled heavily for the empire at the Battle of Frigidus in 394 AD. He had led a force of 20,000 Goths to secure a vital, bloody victory for Emperor Theodosius against a Frankish usurper. Nearly half of his men were slaughtered in the meat grinder of that battle, fighting on the front lines as expendable shock troops. In return for his immense sacrifice, the Roman establishment offered him nothing but contempt. They deliberately denied him the prestigious military title of Magister Militum, refusing to integrate him fully into the upper echelons of imperial command. The Romans believed that Gothic blood was cheap, and that the barbarian federates were merely disposable tools to be used and casually discarded. This staggering arrogance proved to be a fatal miscalculation for the empire. Following the death of Theodosius, the geopolitical stability of the Western Roman Empire fractured irreparably. The brilliant half-vandal general Flavius Stilicho, the only man capable of holding Alaric at bay through diplomacy and force, was abruptly executed by a paranoid Emperor Honorius in 408 AD. In the ensuing political chaos, a vicious wave of anti-barbarian sentiment swept through the Roman military command. Under the orders of a ruthless minister named Olympius, Roman legions mercilessly massacred the wives and children of the Gothic mercenaries who were actively serving in Italy. The empire was suddenly violently hemorrhaging its own most capable defenders. 30,000 enraged Gothic soldiers immediately defected from the Roman banners in response to the slaughter. They marched directly into Alaric's camp, swelling his ranks into a massive, unified instrument of vengeance. The Visigothic king no longer sought mere recognition or a modest settlement for his people. He sought total, humiliating capitulation from the state that had betrayed him. The chokehold, Alaric did not intend to waste the lives of his hardened veterans storming the formidable, towering stones of the Aurelian walls. He was an astute student of Roman warfare, fully understanding that a city of 1 million people was essentially a demographic time bomb. Instead of ordering a costly frontal assault on the gates, Alaric instituted a merciless, highly disciplined blockade. He executed a perfect logistical chokehold, a physical strangling of supply lines that instantly tightened like a noose around the city's throat. His forces systematically blocked every major road leading into the capital, cutting off all overland trade. More devastatingly, they took total tactical control of the winding Tiber River, securing the critical waterway down to the sea. By occupying the port of Ostia, the Visigoths physically severed the massive state-sponsored grain shipments that kept the volatile Roman underclass docile. The vital arteries of the empire were abruptly clamped shut. The spice caravans from the east, the olive oil galleys from Hispania, and the grain fleets from Carthage simply ceased to arrive. Inside the impenetrable walls, the epicenter of the Western world was slowly, agonizingly starving. The macroeconomic shock to the city was immediate and catastrophic, as prices for basic sustenance skyrocketed out of reach for the common plebeian. The daily food rations distributed by the state plummeted almost overnight. They dropped from the standard 3 pounds of bread per person to a mere 1/3 of a pound, and eventually to absolutely nothing. The wealthy elite initially hoarded their vast private reserves, barricading themselves in their palatial estates. They clung to their spiced wines, roasted meats, and silken comforts, while the destitute masses starved in the gutters outside their doors. However, as the autumn dragged into a bitter, relentless winter, starvation breached the marble threshold of the patrician villas. Later, the incredibly wealthy and aged widow of the former Emperor Gratian attempted to liquidate her vast fortune to feed the needy. Her charity was noble but mathematically futile against the insatiable hunger of 1 million dying citizens. The horror inside the walls quickly defied human comprehension. Emaciated corpses began to pile up in the narrow, winding alleys, rotting alongside the accumulated refuse of a paralyzed metropolis. The agonizing stench of death hung heavily over the once glorious capital, providing a fertile breeding ground for a devastating outbreak of plague. The thin veneer of Roman civilization rapidly dissolved under the pressure of the blockade. Men whispered darkly of cold-blooded murders occurring in desolate courtyards for a handful of flour. Despair drove loathsome wretches to the ultimate taboo of cannibalism, forcing the living to feed upon the flesh of the dead just to survive another week. The great imperial metropolis had been effectively reduced to an open-air tomb. The embassy. The Roman Senate, historically the proudest and most arrogant deliberative body on earth, was completely paralyzed by the desperation of the populace. In a frantic bid to survive, they sent an embassy of elite patricians beyond the walls to parley for peace with the barbarian king. The envoys, desperately clinging to their faded imperial arrogance, attempted to bluff their way out of annihilation. They warned Alaric that the Roman populace was vast, heavily armed, and ready to march out in a suicidal, unstoppable frenzy if provoked further by the starvation. The Visigothic king, sitting comfortably atop an insurmountable tactical advantage, literally laughed in the faces of the patrician elite. He delivered a chilling, immortal response to the empty Roman threat. The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed, Alaric joked. He informed the envoys that he would only break the blockade if the city surrendered every single ounce of its accumulated wealth. He demanded that all the gold, all the silver, all the valuable household treasures, and all the barbarian slaves within the walls be immediately laid at his feet. The horrified ambassadors, finally realizing the totality of their absolute defeat, asked the king a trembling question. "If you take all these, what will you leave for the citizens?" the envoys asked. "Their souls," Alaric mocked. The macroeconomic shock. The Senate had no military leverage remaining, and absolutely no hope of rescue from the coward Honorius hiding in Ravenna. They had no choice but to beg the Visigothic king for more specific, mathematically defined terms of surrender to prevent the total annihilation of the capital. In mid-December of 408 AD, Alaric finally relented, replacing his demand for total pillage with a highly calculated, exhaustive ledger of extortion. This was not a chaotic, disorganized looting by a horde of savages. This was a massive macroeconomic shock, a statewide extortion acting as an ancient hostage negotiation that functioned precisely like a hostile corporate liquidation of the Roman state. The terms of the surrender were staggering in their precision, their sheer scale, and their economic implications for the future of Europe. To break the siege and lift the blockade, Alaric demanded the immediate delivery of the following specific commodities: 5,000 pounds of gold, £30,000 of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet dyed hides, £3,000 of black pepper. This meticulously itemized ledger reveals the highly sophisticated economic mind of the Visigothic leadership. Alaric was effectively extorting the city for highly specific forms of dense, easily portable wealth that retained value across all geographic borders. The sheer logistical nightmare of compiling this exact ransom within a starving, paralyzed city cannot be overstated. Liquidating the empire. The gold and silver alone represented a catastrophic hemorrhaging of the empire's remaining financial reserves. The Roman imperial treasury was already functionally empty, drained by decades of civil war and bureaucratic corruption. To meet the demand, the Senate was forced to levy brutal emergency taxes upon its own members, legally extorting the patrician class according to their means. When the private vaults inevitably came up short due to aristocratic corruption and desperate hoarding, the Senate authorized the ultimate cultural desecration. They ordered the systematic stripping of precious metals from the ancient pagan shrines and public monuments. Gold and silver statues of the old gods, which had stood for centuries as testaments to Roman glory, were dragged from their pedestals and unceremoniously melted down into raw bullion. Among the priceless historical monuments liquidated in the smelting fires was a famous, massive statue of Virtus, the divine personification of Roman bravery and military strength. As the contemporary historian Zosimus bitterly lamented, when Virtus was melted into crude currency to pay off a barbarian warlord, it seemed that all that remained of the Roman valor and intrepidity was totally extinguished. Beyond the vast quantities of precious metals, the demand for 4,000 silk tunics was a direct extortion of the empire's most elite trade monopolies. Silk was meticulously woven by the Seres, the people of Han China, and imported over thousands of miles through the perilous overland Silk Road. Since the controversial reign of Emperor Elagabalus, the shimmering, impossibly light fabric had been strictly reserved for the highest echelons of the Roman upper class to denote their extreme wealth. Whereas texture wasn't the many patch you're not happy trapping. When it leads the coup, it just lop what him for the road, it wasn't just fats and crowds heady EVs. Suspicion would transfer students by your dupes. 6 that for mixed clothes, sprode, cora, they'll pillage. So just should hear bread the brelsting whispers of the tilted centuries sports kids all fast feed up soldiers pay lost cut as a spring one between drugs the need for nanos on upper to the sinking that was appling to do taught embedded because blood because got funia. They generally put the simple present Finland up to can I tell those a sex circus be synchronized in the Neoprogistum. The few thousand miles away, I asked for Finland to could be tricameralies. The 3,000 square place rubbed plate dungeon on a dust on this value is simply so what a smart is complicated system they believe with part of figures to the happen effects. But for that with the gutting of face, the value uncovered. Also flop so pity. Since was it prep through face patch or looking for superiority. The symbolism of scarlet, the 3,000 scarlet hides, represent another massive, highly symbolic transfer of status and wealth. These exceptionally fine leathers were dyed with kermes, a brilliant, incredibly expensive red pigment derived from crushed scale insects found on Mediterranean. The extraction process was painfully slow and labor-intensive, requiring thousands of tiny insects to be harvested by hand to produce just a few ounces of the vibrant dye. Scarlet was the traditional color of the Roman military elite, a symbol of martial supremacy and imperial authority that Alaric now explicitly claimed for his own warriors. Roman generals and high-ranking officers wore scarlet cloaks to distinguish themselves on the battlefield and project the terrifying power of the state. By forcing the Senate to hand over 3,000 perfectly dyed hides, the Visigoth was appropriating the visual language of Roman dominance. He intended to clothe his own officers in the crimson leather of their former oppressors. The psychological impact of seeing a Gothic warlord draped in the martial colours of the empire was profound, signalling to the world that the traditional hierarchy had been permanently inverted. The Romans were effectively funding the uniforming of their own conquerors. Yet as devastating as the loss of gold, silk and scarlet was, the final item on the ransom ledger is the most economically fascinating to the modern historian. Placed squarely alongside precious metals, Chinese textiles and imperial dyes was £3,000 of a dried, wrinkled agricultural product. Alaric demanded 3 tons of Indian black pepper, the spice vaults of the Velia.
To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of extorting 3,000 pounds of pepper, one must understand the complex anatomy of the late Roman spice trade. Pepper was not cultivated anywhere near the Mediterranean basin, nor could it be grown in the temperate climates of Europe. It was an exclusive product of the Malabar coast of modern-day Kerala, India, requiring a highly specific tropical environment to thrive. Sourcing this tiny black drupe required one of the most complex, capital-intensive maritime supply chains in human history.
Around the 1st century AD, an intrepid Greek merchant named Hippolus finally unlocked the meteorological secret of the Indian Ocean monsoon winds.
By riding the fierce southwest summer monsoons, massive Roman cargo ships could sail directly from the Red Sea to the coast of India in just 40 days, completely bypassing the tedious, heavily taxed overland Arab monopolies. The return journey, carrying immense fragrant cargoes of pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, relied on the northeast winter monsoons to blow the heavily laden ships back to the Egyptian ports, like Berenike. From the rocky shores of the Red Sea, the raw pepper was hauled by heavily armed camel caravans across the scorching eastern desert to the Nile River. It was then floated down to the bustling commercial hub of Alexandria, before finally being shipped across the Mediterranean to the sprawling docks of Ostia. This massive intercontinental journey made black pepper an incredibly expensive and highly scrutinized commodity. During the 1st century, the elder Pliny grumbled bitterly that the empire's insatiable taste for pepper and eastern luxuries was violently draining the Roman economy. He estimated that a staggering 50 million sesterces were hemorrhaging out of the empire to India every single year, trading hard Roman silver for fleeting flavors. Once the precious pepper finally reached the city of Rome, it was not sold in open-air street markets like common grain or local wine. It was guarded with the same fierce intensity as state bullion. During the reign of Emperor Domitian, the Roman state constructed a massive, highly secure complex specifically to house this immense wealth, the Horrea Piperataria. The Horrea Piperataria were the grand imperial spice warehouses built directly onto the southwestern slopes of the Velia Hill, nestled securely between the Roman Forum, the Palatine, and Esquiline hills. This sprawling, highly fortified complex was built on descending terraces, featuring expansive porticoed courtyards and deep, specialized storage pools. It was a veritable fortress of flavor and pharmacology, heavily guarded by dedicated military garrisons to prevent any unauthorized access or theft. Inside these fireproof brick vaults, vast quantities of Egyptian and Arabian aromatics were meticulously catalogued, ground in special stone mills, and distributed in sealed, stamped papyrus bags. The famous Greek physician Galen of Pergamon even maintained his own apothecary within this complex, utilizing the high security to protect his rare medicinal herbs and philosophical texts. When Alaric submitted his ransom ledger, the desperate Senate undoubtedly turned their attention to the Horrea Piperataria first. The logistical nightmare. However, raising 3,000 pounds of the spice in a single, immediate payment was an astronomical logistical undertaking. In the Roman weight system, a libra pound was equivalent to approximately 323 grams. Therefore, 3,000 Roman pounds represented nearly a full metric ton of dried, extremely lightweight peppercorns. Because peppercorns are small, hollowed out by the drying process, and relatively light, the physical volume of this demand was massive. It would have required hundreds of large burlap sacks or heavy wooden crates to successfully transport the spice. It is highly likely that the imperial warehouses on the Velia Hill were largely depleted due to the grueling months of the blockade and the total cessation of maritime trade. To fulfill Alaric's massive quota, the Senate would have been forced to dispatch armed guards into the private estates of the surviving patricians. They systematically ransacked the pantries and hidden cellars of the rich, violently seizing private stores of spice, just as they had seized private gold and silver. The sensory experience of compiling this ransom must have been overwhelming, as the pungent, sharp aroma of a ton of crushed pepper filled the starving, plague-ridden streets. The Romans absolutely adored their pepper, utilizing it in everything from roasted pork and vegetable purees to complex mulled wines and intricate pharmacological remedies. The renowned surviving cookbook of Apicius reveals that nearly 75% of elite Roman recipes demanded the pungent bite of the exotic spice. By forcing the Romans to surrender it in such immense bulk, Alaric was actively stripping the elite of their daily culinary identity and their most cherished comforts, the geopolitical asset. Why did a Gothic warlord want 3 tons of a tropical vine? For centuries, a persistent historical myth has suggested that medieval and ancient armies prized spices simply to mask the foul taste of rotting meat. This is a profound economic misunderstanding that completely ignores the extreme value of the commodity. Pepper was never used to salvage spoiled food. The spice itself was far too expensive to waste on rotten, diseased flesh. The demand for pepper was fundamentally about essential medicine, extreme social status, and most importantly, highly portable wealth. Alaric demanded the spice because pepper had effectively evolved into a hard geopolitical asset, a physical vault of wealth that transcended the collapsing borders of failing states. During the late Roman Empire, the imperial economy was repeatedly shattered by severe bouts of hyperinflation. Desperate emperors continuously debased the currency, stripping the silver content out of the standard denarius to fund endless civil wars and vanity projects. As fiat coins became increasingly hollowed out and worthless, global merchants demanded payment in raw, unadulterated commodities. Black pepper held intrinsic, universal value across the entire known world. It did not rust like iron, it did not melt like ice, and its supply was naturally restricted by the brutal realities of the Indian Ocean monsoons. In the early 5th century, a tightly packed sack of peppercorns was an internationally recognized currency, widely accepted as commodity money. It was a highly liquid asset that could be traded anywhere, from the burning sands of Persia to the cold, dense forests of Germania. With 3,000 pounds of pepper, Alaric could easily buy the loyalty of rival barbarian chieftains, secure expensive mercenary contracts, or fund massive supply trains for his marching army. He was ransoming the city to build a sovereign, fully independent Gothic treasury. A shift in power, this specific ransom demand perfectly illustrates the historical thesis proposed by geopolitical historian Peter Heather regarding the fall of the empire. Heather forcefully argues that the Roman Empire did not fall simply due to internal moral decay, but because centuries of violent interaction with Rome had fundamentally transformed the barbarian tribes. The Goths were no longer disorganized raiders, they were highly sophisticated political actors who thoroughly understood the levers of macroeconomic power. Alaric did not initially want to destroy the Roman system, he wanted to dominate it and secure a permanent legitimate place within its hierarchy. By systematically extorting gold, Chinese silk, military scarlet, and Indian pepper, the Visigoth was actively demanding the ultimate symbols of Roman imperial authority. He was proving to the known world that he, not the coward Honorius hiding in the Ravenna swamps, controlled the flow of global luxury and capital. When the Senate finally amassed the staggering ransom in late 408 AD, the physical transfer of wealth was a spectacle of absolute, unprecedented humiliation. A massive convoy of heavy wooden wagons, groaning under the immense weight of raw bullion, fine silks, dyed leathers, and thousands of pounds of pungent black spices, rumbled out of the city gates. The accumulated wealth of centuries was unceremoniously handed over to the surrounding barbarian camps. Adding to the devastating loss of capital, the Senate was forced to fulfill Alaric's final, most demographically ruinous demand. Nearly 40,000 Gothic and barbarian slaves, who had been brutally exploited within the city for years, were immediately emancipated. They poured out of the gates and enthusiastically enlisted in Alaric's ranks, transforming his army into an unstoppable juggernaut of 40,000 hardened veterans. Flush with unimaginable wealth and a vastly expanded military force, Alaric honored the immediate terms of the treaty. He officially lifted the strangling blockade in late December of 408 AD, pulling his forces back from the gates. He allowed the surviving traumatized citizens of Rome 3 days of free access to the markets at the port, allowing them to desperately trade whatever meager goods they had left for imported corn. The Visigoths then broke camp, withdrawing their massive forces to the rolling hills of Etruria to winter in absolute luxury. They dined comfortably on Roman grain, wore the priceless silk of Chinese emperors, draped themselves in the scarlet hides of the legions, and seasoned their meals with the most expensive spices of the Indian subcontinent. It was a complete reversal of the geopolitical order. The final transfer of wealth. The massive ransom of 408 AD provided Rome with a momentary gasping respite from its ultimate fate. The historic transfer of wealth was meant to secure a lasting peace and an official alliance, but the staggering political incompetence of the Roman court ultimately doomed the empire. Emperor Honorius, safe behind the impassable marshes of Ravenna, arrogantly refused to honor the political terms of the treaty or grant Alaric his promised military titles. Infuriated by the continuous, short-sighted betrayals of the imperial court, Alaric marched his massively enriched, newly reinforced army back to the walls of the Eternal City. Following a series of failed negotiations and brief skirmishes, the end finally arrived. On August 24, 410 AD, the gates were quietly opened from the inside, likely by sympathetic slaves, and the Visigoths poured in. For the first time in exactly 800 years, since the days of the Gauls, the city of Rome was violently sacked by a foreign enemy. For 3 terrifying days, the Visigoths pillaged the remaining palaces, stripped the public buildings of their remaining wealth, and shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility forever. When St. Jerome, living far away in Bethlehem, heard the devastating news, he wept and wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Yet, the physical violence of the 410 AD sack was merely the bloody epilogue to a story that had already concluded 2 years prior. The true death blow to the Western Roman Empire was not delivered by the sword, but by the ledger. The macroeconomic shock of the 408 AD ransom was the exact moment the economic center of gravity permanently shifted away from the Mediterranean elite. By systematically extorting the wealth of the Horrea Piperataria, Alaric proved that the complex global supply chains of late antiquity could be successfully hijacked by force. He demonstrated to every watching barbarian tribe that the ultimate power did not reside in marble columns or ancient senatorial titles, but in the direct control of hard, portable assets. In the dark shadow of the starving city, black pepper completely transitioned from a mere culinary indulgence into an undeniable instrument of geopolitical supremacy. 3,000 pounds of a wrinkled black Indian drupe had brought the greatest empire in human history to its knees. The ransom of Rome firmly established a terrifying new reality for the European continent. The long era of the legions was officially over, and the era of the warlords had begun. And the warlords, it turned out, possessed a very expensive, highly spiced palate.